Okay, well, I will get started. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are watching this, or if you're watching it on YouTube, whatever time of day it is. Um, Thanks very much for joining. This is the sort of next installment of the monthly RPN on central bank communications webinar. The title today was not a title of a paper. I gave it a sufficiently broad title reflecting the fact that what we have today are three presentations. Each presenter will have about 20 plus 5 minutes to sort of present some of the work they're working on. I realized when I came up with the title, The Next Generation, I realized that they're not the next generation. They're the current generation. They're just much younger than me. So that's what I was really reflecting. We're going to go in the following order. So Alina will go first, and then Gianpaolo, and then Peter. And just to not use up any time, Alina, if you want to share your slides and we get going pretty immediately.
Yeah.
Usual rules apply for the audience. If you have questions, there's a Q&A box. If you put it in there, I'll pass those comments on at the opportune moments. If we don't get to your question after a presenter has gone, they can type an answer in themselves and respond that way. Okay, Alina, tell me why the messenger matters.
Great. Thanks a lot, Michael, and thanks a lot for including me today. I'm happy to talk a bit about what I'm currently working on. And as you see, it's about why the messenger matters, particularly in the euro area. So as you probably all know, if you're here, central banks communicate for a few reasons. For instance, to manage economic and financial volatility after decision making, but also to instill trust and to manage inflation expectations. Now, if they do that successfully, then central bank communication works as a monetary policy tool. And as such, central banks have been using this not just by communicating to expert audiences, but also communicating more to the wider public. But there are voices in the literature if that's even successful. So what I'm asking is, could it be that depending on the messenger, communicating with the wider public is actually more or less successful? And so let me visualize what exactly I mean. Does it matter if someone like Mario Draghi on the left is communicating central bank communication, or someone like Christine Lagarde? Now, we know from the literature that some characteristics of central bankers matter, and they're definitely being perceived. But in the euro area, where nationality is very prevalent, we don't actually know how that is playing out. Let me give you some motivation. I have a sample of tweets that span over 6 years. So 3 years are covering the presidency of Draghi, and 3 years are covering the presidency of Lagarde. And so these tweets are in different languages. In total, I have 5 languages. One part of the sample is English tweets, but then I also have German, Spanish, Italian, and French tweets. And so here I'm showing you some word clouds. So word clouds are just showing you the frequency of words in terms of their size. So the larger the words here, the more frequent they are in the sample. And let me draw your attention to the green terms. So here in the English sample, Draghi and Lagarde have almost equal sizes. So that means they occur at very similar frequency in the sample. Now, if we look at the Italian sample, then Draghi is very large. So Draghi is very prevalent, whereas Lagarde is barely mentioned in the tweet. So it barely gets under the top 100 words. And then if we look at the French sample, then the opposite is the case. So Lagarde is very prevalent, whereby Draghi is here the small word, so it's barely under the top 100 words. So this is just to say that there seems to be, it seems to be important who the messenger is in terms of their nationality and how they're being picked up. Now, what do I do in my paper? I'm asking, how is central bank communication affected by multinational messengers, so the policymakers, but also by multinational receivers, the citizens? And specifically, do in-group effects exist? And so what I mean by in-group throughout this paper is a match in nationality between the messenger and the receiver. There's 2 dimensions that I'm looking at for this effect. So for the effectiveness of communication, and if you think about communication as a signal, then the first aspect is, what about signal availability? So here, what I'm looking at is the information spread, and that's through the media in my case. And the second aspect is belief updating. So how much do agents actually take on the signal when they receive it? You can also think of this as perceived signal precision. Now, what I find is that information spread increases for the in-group, and that's a supply effect. So there's more information being supplied, but actually it's not a demand effect. So agents don't actually demand more information. And the second finding is that in-group effects in terms of belief updating also exist. So in-group agents update more strongly to information from the central bank. So overall, this makes central bank communication more effective for the in-group. All right, so the type of evidence I'm showing you today is twofold. So I have observational evidence from Twitter. I already showed you the data. And that is to cover real world evidence, to show you that this is a phenomenon that actually exists in the real world, not just in the lab. And the benefit of Twitter is that it's high frequency. So whenever we think of belief updating to a communication event, obviously what we want is very high frequency data, because if we only have monthly observations from a survey, then we don't actually know if people are responding to a communication event or to anything else that could have happened in that month. So this type of data allows me to assess information supply and information spread generally. I complement this evidence with an experiment. So I design an inflation forecasting experiment where the treatment is a randomization of the messenger of information. I run that experiment in 4 countries, so Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. And I get 100 participants in each of these countries. I ran the experiment in late 2023. And what this experiment allows me to do is to actually get a causal effect, to say something about inflation expectations, to better understand the mechanism, and also to understand information demand. Okay, if there are no questions so far, I'll start by showing you the experimental design. So as I said, I'm designing an inflation forecasting experiment, and it's probably closest to what Michael was working on with Ryan. Basically, participants are asked to forecast inflation. And because I'm interested in an update, what I'm assessing their forecasts on and on their belief updating on is just a standard Bayesian belief updating framework. So there's nothing special about it. Posteriors are just a combination of priors and signals weighted by their relative precision. So of course, to be able to assess whether belief updating is Bayesian or not, what I need from participants is their prior beliefs and their posterior beliefs about inflation. And then of course, the respective precision. I think it's best to show you the interface that participants actually saw in the experiment. So participants got 10 periods of actual realized inflation in the euro area. And then they were asked to forecast the 11th period. And here I also interactively showed them their forecast in a graph. So the point forecast was this green square. And then I also asked participants to indicate an uncertainty range. So this range is indicated by the triangles. And this uncertainty range then gives me the precision of their forecast. To incentivize decisions, I just followed the learning to forecast literature, whereby participants got more bonus pay the closer their forecasted value was to the realized inflation value. And also in terms of their uncertainty range, they got more bonus pay if that uncertainty range was smaller, but only as long as the realized value of inflation would actually fall within that range.
Alina, just a question that's come in, and since I didn't see, I think it's about the experimental design, but you can answer it on both. How did you select your sample? So,
right,
did you randomly, or what? Just give people some sense of that.
So for the experiment, I got the participants from Prolific. It's not a representative sample, but participants had to have the nationality out of the big 4, but they also had to reside in these countries. Yeah, and the Twitter sample. The Twitter sample is I collect tweets based on their language and whether they contain keywords ECB or European Central Bank. Or the translated equivalents in the respective language. So for the Twitter sample, what I proxy nationality with is obviously language.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Right, so that's the first key decision that I'm interested in. And then, of course, for the posterior belief or the posterior forecast, participants, they get a signal here in period 11 in purple, but they also get, and obviously this comes from a messenger, and they also get the forecast history of that messenger. So they get the entire history here displayed. When they hover over these points, they actually get the values, and that allows participants to gauge what the signal precision is. And then, of course, they have to re-enter, or they can update their forecast, which then gives me the posterior beliefs, and again, the posterior precision. Again, decisions are incentivized to minimize forecast error. The second decision that I'm interested in is information demand. And what I do is I give participants 3 pieces of information, or more, to be more accurate, I give them 3 buttons that they can click on. And if they click on these buttons, then there's some background information revealed. And that information is about how the messenger came to forecast exactly that value. And what I do as the experimenter, I count how many buttons participants click on, and that gives me the information demand. Overall, participants play 6 forecasting tasks. So what I explained to you here, that will be 1 forecasting task, and they play 6 rounds of this. And obviously each forecasting task has a different messenger, and that's a treatment. So that is a within subject design. There's 3 types of messengers, and 2 experts or 2 messengers in each of these types are being played. So the first group of experts are just generic experts, where the only thing that varies is the nationality, and participants play 1 in-group nationality expert and 1 out-group nationality expert. The second group is, again, in and out-group nationality experts, but now these experts are representing the ECB. And the last group of experts are just generic experts that represent the ECB or the respective national bank, national central bank. So that would be, for the Germans, the Bundesbank, for the French, the Banque de France, and so on. And they don't have a nationality attached. The way I deliver the treatment is just through text and nothing else. So only the bold text would change here. And this is an example of the generic ECB expert. Okay. Now, let me get to the results. So first of all, how is information spread being affected by being in the in-group? So for this, I go back to my Twitter sample, and I'm showing you here the proportion of tweets by language. So overall, you see that the Spanish are tweeting the most, followed by the Italians, and then the Germans and the French are just not tweeting as much compared to the other languages. Now, if I split the sample into the time where Draghi is in term and the time where Lagarde is in term, the picture changes slightly. So look at the Italians. So Italians would be in the in-group with Draghi and in the out-group with Lagarde. And you see that they tweet significantly more during Draghi's term time than during Lagarde's term time. If you look at the French that are in the in-group with Lagarde and in the out-group with Draghi, the opposite is the case. So they tweet more when Lagarde is in the office, and they tweet significantly less when Draghi is in the office. Then if you look at the Spanish and the Germans, there's virtually no difference between the term times. Now, that leads me to conclude that information supply increases significantly for the in-group. And if I put this in a regression, then this is roughly 10 percentage points.
Alina, just some people are asking some questions about about this graph. So, what do you mean by overall spread? Just be a bit clearer on that. And then the other one is, do these include retweets as well?
Yes. So overall spread, I mean all tweets, including retweets, and also quote retweets, if in the original part of the quote retweet, the key terms ECB or European Central Bank also occur. And information spread, I mean, that's exactly what it means. So how many tweets there are, basically. I hope this answered the question. All right. So that is information supply that increases for the in-group. But then the question is, does that also account for demand? So is actually demand increasing or not? And here, what I look at is the buttons from my experiment. So how many additional or how many buttons did participants click on depending on who the messenger was? So remember, they could click on up to 3 buttons. They could also click on 0 buttons. And what I find for the generic in-group expert and out-group expert, participants click on one to 2 buttons, but there's no significant difference. And actually, it doesn't matter which messenger I'm looking at, whether it's with ECB context or if it's the national central bank expert, there's just virtually no difference. And that leads me to conclude that information demand is not affected by the messenger. Actually, what this information demand is affected by is the uncertainty in the inflation scenario, which is also randomized. But that's something I'm not going to go into much here. That's in the paper. I'm happy to talk about this after today's seminar. Okay, but takeaway is that information demand is unaffected by the messenger. And now I'm going to the second part of the dimensions that I would like to discuss today, which is belief updating. So let me start by giving you some findings from Twitter, some patterns, maybe some motivating evidence. And that's how do people on Twitter update their beliefs after a press conference. Now, I proxy beliefs here by tweet sentiment. So tweet sentiment ranges from -1 to +1, and it just indicates how positive or how negative text sentiment is. Because I'm interested in belief updates, I need, again, a prior and a posterior, whereby the prior is the last tweet that a Twitter user would post just before a press conference and within the 7 days of the quiet period of the central bank to account for no other ECB communication, potentially moving people's sentiment beliefs. And then the posterior is the first tweet of the same user just after the press conference, and I allow for a 24-hour window for Twitter users to be active on Twitter. So what I'm plotting here is the absolute belief updates so that negative or positive belief changes don't cancel each other out. And also I take the relative belief updates to the average of a press conference belief update. And the reason I do this is because a press conference could have very different information content. And so to make it comparable over time, I take the relative belief updates. And so what this graph shows you here is that Italians are just updating much more than all the other languages overall. So that's why they are much higher and much further away from 0, which would be the average. And then all the other languages are updating less than the average. Now, again, if I split the sample into press conferences by Draghi and press conferences by Lagarde, what you see here for the Italians is that they update even more during Draghi's press conferences here in green, and they update significantly less during Lagarde's press conferences here in blue. Overall, they still update more strongly than other nationalities. But here it's about the relative comparison. Looking at the French, again, they update more strongly during Lagarde's press conferences and less so during Draghi's press conferences. And then the Germans, for them, there's no difference between Draghi and Lagarde's press conferences. And for the Spanish, they update relatively more during Lagarde's press conferences than Draghi's press conferences. And what I will account this to is the fact that at a press conference of the ECB, also the vice president is present. And the current vice president is actually Spanish. So de Guindos is also sitting next to Lagarde, and his term time is coinciding largely with Lagarde's term. So I would account the stronger belief updating of the Spanish to de Guindos. But I think this alone shows you that it's hard to make any causal inference from this. And so the reason, this gives me reason to basically show you the results of my experiment, but take this as sort of a pattern that actually exists in the real world. Okay, so now on to the causal evidence from the experiment. Is there actually a causal effect on belief updating? Does that also extend to inflation expectations? and what is it in size if the only thing we change is nationality. And to get to this effect, I use the treatments of the in-group expert. So for French participants, it would be the expert from France, and I would compare this to a random other one. The way I estimate this is by simple OLS, where I get a coefficient for the weighted prior of participants, and then I get one coefficient each for each messenger treatment on the weighted signals. And then I compare these coefficients for equality. And what I find is that there is a positive causal in-group effect to belief updating, and that is around 5 percentage points. Now, to put the size in relation, compared to the rational or compared to the Bayesian benchmark, this closes the gap of underusing the signal by halving it. Okay, so across my entire sample, participants are still underusing the signal by 10 percentage points roughly, and so an increase in 5 percentage points closes this gap significantly. Okay, now let me take stock. There are positive in-group effects when it comes to central bank communication based on people's nationality. And there are 2 dimensions through which this works. First is the increased likelihood of receiving a signal that works through raising the supply of information, but not affecting the demand of information necessarily. And the second effect is that the signal uptake is causally increased. Now, what does that mean for policymaking? There is 2 questions that I asked myself and then also included treatments in the experiment. First, are there potential benefits to communicating through other ECB board members, so board members of different nationality? What I do here, or what I use here, is I compare experts with a nationality that represent the ECB. And again, what I compare is the in-group expert to the out-group expert, but now in institutional context. What I find is that now the in-group effect is dampened and not significant anymore. So there's still a positive tendency to update more to the in-group expert from the ECB, but it's not significant and it's also smaller. But in fact, it's actually driven, this effect becomes very significant and quite large if I only use participants that know representative policymakers from the ECB. I don't have time to go into this much more today, but I'm happy to talk about this later. The second policy...
You've got about another 2 minutes left.
That's fine. Okay. So the second policy question that I was asking is, are there benefits to communicating through the Eurosystem's national central banks? And what I do here is I compare the generic experts from the ECB to the generic expert from the national central banks. And what I find is that there is more belief updating to the national central bank. So there is benefits to communicating through the NCBs, but of course this comes with risks that I'm also happy to discuss later. And this leads me to my conclusion. So I use Twitter evidence to find that there are positive in-group effects when it comes to information diffusion. But I then use also experimental evidence to show that there's a causal effect to belief updating of inflation expectations, but also to show that there is no increased demand when it comes to information for in-group participants. And I'm happy to discuss more on the policies, whether we should communicate more through NCBs or other ECB board members, because I do find evidence that goes in the direction that this could actually be beneficial. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. I think you muted, Michael.
It's only been 3 years of using Zoom, so that was excellent timing. Thank you, and very interesting paper. There's one question that I'm going to leave for you to answer yourself in the Q&A. You can type an answer to it, but I have one question that you don't even have to answer now, but just think about. So this is very focused on the ECB setup. I guess there's an interesting question, given that quite a few central banks, not that many, but enough, have a more established sort of state with central bank related to it. So you could take the Bank of England as an example, but they have appointed non-nationals as their governor. And the question is whether this is a kind of the ECB is still quite young, and people still think of themselves as Austrian and then European, and therefore the ECB is seen as being in Germany and not them, or whether it is exactly about this pure in-group effect where I listen better to Philip Lane than Isabel Schnabel because he's also Irish. I listen to them both just in case either's listening.
It's a big question. I'll just give a very brief answer. I think because I see that with the institutional context, the in-group effect gets dampened. I think there's more to it. So when people hear ECB, they think more about other dimensions as well. So it's exactly what you're saying. And it becomes much harder to disentangle it. So yeah, definitely.
Okay, good to think about. Gianpaolo, do you want to start sharing your slides and we'll move straight on?
Yes.
I told all the participants I was going to be very tough on time, but well done on time, Alina.
Can you see the slides and everything?
See the slides? Your video is off, but if you're happy, it's coming on now. Okay, good.
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me here. I'm going to present joint work with my colleague Ali Upal. I'm an applied theorist from UC San Diego, working on the communication transmission. Ali is a macroeconomist, also from UC San Diego. Okay, so today, the paper we're going to present is a working paper, so any feedback is actually very useful. We're going to address the following two questions. So if the Fed explicitly cares about financial market stability, what are the implications when markets are strategic? That is, they anticipate this concern. And the second is, what do the implications that we find in point one imply for the optimal communication strategy of the Fed, or in particular, the feasible communication strategy of the Fed? So the preliminary findings of our very stylized applied theory model are that large market players might account for their policy influence. So a Fed or a central bank in general caring about market stability might actually create some policy influence, provide some policy influence to large market players that might account for this and creating a policy distortion that also causes a welfare inefficiency. The second main finding is that it might be optimal to appoint, at least from a society perspective, a central banker that we call kitish, that is a central banker that puts less weight on market stability than what would be welfare optimal in a non-strategic setting. And the third main finding that or at least insight of our paper is that there is actually a surprising trade-off between having a central bank that cares about market and one that is able to communicate transparently. And we'll explain why that's the case. So the literature documents several concerns that the Fed appears to have when it comes to thinking about financial markets. One is about how markets would perform with high versus low rates, with the idea of the Fed put. The other is whether implementing policies that come as a surprise, so they are disruptive in a sense, can create volatility and a costly adjustment that can hurt especially highly leveraged financial institutions. With the third idea being also that, with the interconnectedness of the financial system, there might be, a systemic risk that comes out of, creating excess volatility and, compromising the health of highly leveraged financial institution. So the other thing that we want to think about before actually delving into the stylized model is whether we can expect market players to some extent think that the Fed cares about the market stability. So here in the paper, we propose some anecdotal evidence and discuss more in deep. I'm just going to go through some stylized example. One thing that we discuss is how the stock market future price implied expectation about the future rate changed dramatically after the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. And when looking at basically the minutes of the subsequent FOMC meetings, we do see that policymakers that would have otherwise, or maybe declared that they would have otherwise been more supportive of rate hikes, cite financial stability concern as reason for being more moderate in the policy changes. On the other hand, there seems to be additional reason for why markets might expect policymakers to care about their financial position and the effects on policies on them. And the idea is that actually Fed governors, so the policymaker, meet with financial market leaders and interest group very often, and in particular compared to real economy and other stakeholders that meet with financial interest group more than 3 times as often. So there seems to be the idea that the financial market leaders would know that there's a special attention that is devoted to them by the policymakers. Okay, so I'm going to basically be less detailed as possible in terms of maths, not to bore the audience, but it's useful to fix the ideas in terms of the structure of the game. So we're going to have 3 time periods. At time 0, the central bank observes a first shock to the economy stabilizing policy and can communicate information to market players about this shock. The shock is otherwise private information. At time 1, market players observe what is being communicated and can update their expectations about future policy, and they pick they make an investment decision. They pick an investment. They can adjust their investment positions. At time 2, at the end of the game, the central bank, knowing what are the financial position, investment positions of the market players, and observing a second realization of the economy stabilizing policy shock, in particular one that occurs after communication. You can think of it as occurring during the blackout period. They pick eventually the rate, and payoffs are realized at the end of the game. So what are payoffs in our simple game? We are not going for realism. What we are going for is the minimal and the most parsimonious specification of the game that would allow us to kind of capture what we think are important strategic incentives. So as for the market institutions, one incentive, one term in the payoff function is simply basically the difference between the policy, the investment choice that they make, and the policy that is going to be implemented by the market players. So the idea here is that market players have an incentive to form accurately their policy expectations, and then pick XI to minimize, to be basically the investment position that is consistent with these policy expectations. However, we're going to have a second term that pins down a directional preference over rates. So there's going to be some structural interest rate exposure. We assume that this beta is greater than 0. In practice, for the implications of the model to carry through, we don't really need the beta to be greater. It's important that it's different from 0. Nonetheless, in the paper, we do provide some arguments for why it seems reasonable based on recent evidence to think that these financial institutions, or to assume that on average these financial institutions, especially in the banking sector, might be better off after surprising rate cuts rather than surprising rate hikes. As far as this central bank objective is concerned, we're going to have the weighted sum of 2 terms. The first term is the conventional loss function, as it could pop up out of like a New Keynesian model. Remember that, so one thing that I forgot to specify before is that the sum of the 2 shocks to the economy stabilizing rate, omega, is going to be basically the policy that can balance optimally the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So the first term here is the conventional loss. The second term is a market adjustment. It captures this policymaker concerns for market stability. In particular, is a loss that kind of average out market surprises, and it's the highest the greater the mismatch between the market positions and the implemented rate. Alpha, which is going to be a very important parameter in the analysis, is the relative welfare weight of this market adjustment cost term. And we interpret this and the payoff of the central bank as representing welfare, at least in our analysis. So the first step that we go through in the paper is finding what would be, in this super simple game, the optimal path of play. That is, how would we want players to play if the goal is minimizing the expected loss of the central bank? So the first best would involve full disclosure by the central bank about the information about the future policy rate that they observe at the beginning of the period. Markets would then pick an investment position that is fully consistent with the future policy expectations, so with what has been transparently communicated by the central bank. And at the end of the game, the central bank would pick a rate that average out the concerns for stabilizing the real economy and not disrupting markets. So it would be a weighted average of omega and the average, that is the economy stabilizing rate, and the average market position. Now, on the equilibrium path, the policy ends up fully responsive to innovation in the state of the economy, of the real economy, that have been communicated, but there's going to be under reaction to what happens after, to the shocks that happens after communication to the markets. And this is pretty common in the papers that study monetary policy. When policymakers are concerned about not disrupting market, the idea is that the underreaction allows to kind of contain the market instability due to a policy surprise. In practice, what do we expect to happen in a case where, so first of all, the first best can be an equilibrium in the game that we have presented, as long as the market players the central bank cares about are atomistic. So none of them is large. However, we think that the central bank in practice interacts and devotes attention to a few large and systemic investors. So in the model, to analyze what would happen in this case, we start by assuming this symmetric information. That is, we assume that there's no communication problem in the first period. The central bank communicates transparently or can commit to transparent communication. So as far as the optimal policy strategy of the central bank, so the incentive compatible policy strategy is concerned, there's no difference relative to the first best. So the central bank will still average out its incentives, in a sense, or its goal to stabilize the economy and not to disrupt market, much in the same way as we saw in the first best. However, now the large investors can use their market power to make rate hikes harder for the central bank. The idea here is that when the central bank cares a few large institutions, then the decision of these institutions might, even in a small fashion, but might actually influence directly what the central bank ends up choosing as an optimal policy. So in equilibrium, we find that this means that the investment decisions of the market players are biased downwards. And so is the policy on the equilibrium path relative to what is the first best policy. Just to convey some intuition about what's happening is that by investing as if low rates were expecting, these large financial institutions can make it optimal for the central bank to avoid adversarial rate changes, that is, from their perspective, big rate hikes. The central bank would then accommodate, at least partially, to avoid market instability. So relative to the first best, the central bank is worse off because we know that there is a bias in the policy that is chosen, while market can profit from their policy, so their ability to kind of influence to some extent the policy that will be chosen in the future. So we then switch to thinking about the potential remedies, and we go along the lines of Rogoff's paper on Hawkes versus Dobbs. So that's why we call the central banker that put little weight on markets a kite-ish central banker. So imagine that we can appoint a central banker that assigns a weight to the stability term that is different from alpha, that is the welfare weight of market stability in the objective function of the central bank. Would this get us back to the first best? So what we find is that it is indeed optimal to have a central banker who cares less about stability, so that is like characterized by a weight on financial stability that is lower than the welfare weight. However, and indeed this pushes welfare closer to the first best. Why is that the case? Because by reducing the weight on market stability, it also reduces the policy influence of these large market players. And as a result, what we see is that basically there's less policy distortions. However, we don't want a central bank that does not care about market stability, as by assumption that factors in welfare, because it would, while it does reduce the investment decision, it would create large surprises. So the central bank would be overreacting relative to optimal to the innovations in the state that have not been communicated. Switching now to communication. So far, we have assumed that fully transparent communication about the state is feasible, or the central bank can commit. And we show that there is a conflict of interest arising between markets and the central bank, whereby markets actually invest as if lower rates were expected than the central bank would want. So this puts us in a classic cheap talk setting of Crawford and Sobel. And in this setting, we know that actually transparent communication is not possible in equilibrium. For those in the audience that are not familiar, the argument is as follows. So imagine that market institutions truly believe that the central bank is communicating truthfully about their future rate expectations. Then we know from the previous analysis that these financial institutions might invest as if lower rates were actually expecting the true expectations. But the central bank would then have an incentive to kind of compensate for this investment distortion by announcing expectation about future rates that are actually, hiking more in practice than what they are truly expecting. So that would make transparent communication not feasible in equilibrium. The takeaway of Crawford-Sobel is that, and of course in our paper we show that's indeed true, in equilibrium there's no full information transmission. In this case, the central bank is not able to convey all the information that they have at time zero about the future policy. So we know that communication would reduce market instability because it would generate less surprises when the policy is chosen at the end of the game. But this strategic consideration make communication hard, creating a loss of useful information and therefore generating more policy surprises than would be optimal. So the information loss makes both the central bank and market players worse off in equilibrium relative to when the central bank can commit to fully transparent communication. And this information loss is kind of increasing in the investment bias of the market. So what is interesting here is that the greater alpha, the greater weight the central bank puts on surprising, not surprising the markets in a sense. And so the more that we'll be trying to correct the policy ex post to kind of adjust it to the current market positions. However, it is also the case that the implication of our model is the greater this weight, the less informative is communication ex ante, because the central bank has the incentive to correct for a larger market bias when communicating. So there's going to be a greater loss of information transmission. And this kind of means that, on the other hand, more surprises will come up because of this loss of communication about future intentions by the policymaker. So I'm about to conclude, but we can ask ourselves, okay, given these frictions in communication that arise from the conflict of interest, how would the optimal central bank be in terms of whether we want a central bank that is kiteish, so that put less weight on market stability? We do find indeed that when there's this problem of communication, the optimal central banker cares even less about market stability. And strikingly, even market players, so these financial institutions, can be better off with a central banker that puts no weight on their stability relative to one that puts the actual true welfare weight alpha. And the idea here is that investors are better off if the policy is predictable. And so when a central banker does not care about market transparency or cares little about market instability, the investors have less incentive to invest strategically. But this also makes transparent communication more feasible. And therefore, there is more information conveyed, and there's a predictability gain even from the point of view of financial institutions. They're more able to tell what the future policy will be. And as long as this gain is stronger than what they lose in terms of policy influence, then everyone, the central bank, the society, and investors as well, benefit from a central bank that puts little
so
weight.
Gianpaolo, just very quickly, there's a question that's come in that is, does the stability come from the synchronization of the elements of communication, so the decision and the outlook, or is it just by virtue of the communication itself?
So I think the stability in our model comes from the basically ability of this market players to correctly predict what the policy of the central bank will be. So it's a term that basically picks up only surprise, the instability due to surprising policies, and therefore communication factors in. but we are not accounting for, real economy effects or, instability due to those aspects of the game.
Okay, let me ask another sort of general question. So in this world, it falls on monetary policy to deal with financial instability. If we introduced other policy tools,
Sure.
and arguably even another committee could even be separate, that presumably would allow us to go back on the monetary policy side to rog
Yes.
off and let the other committee do its thing.
Yes, so I do think that the main one of the main implications is not that policymakers should not care about financial stability, but it's that potentially it's not monetary policy that should that's the insight of our model. It's not to monetary policy to fix stability concerns. There might be other policies. We don't mean to claim that financial stability shouldn't be a concern indeed. As you mentioned, yeah, I think we are aligned in terms of in the paper as well. With your suggestion.
Well, let me even push back a little on myself though, because you don't want to just conclude that. I think you don't want to end up in a world where you say, okay, well, the answer is don't be in this world. You could even be in a world where there is another committee, but there's enough overlap. So the Bank of England has a financial policy committee, a monetary policy committee, but there's quite a bit of overlap of membership, and obviously they're both within one institution, so they sort of care about both. So you might even, another takeaway, which I took from your last slide, would be something about the way in which you incorporate concerns about financial stability, even residual concerns after countercyclical capital buffers or whatever the Financial Policy Committee are doing. If we think, and again, the ECB's made this argument, disruptions in the financial sector can have problematic impacts on the transmission of monetary policy. So you may still care beyond the volatility per se, because it's going to impact how your policy operates. And I guess what I take from the last slide result is that whatever that concern is, communicating systematic, predictable behaviors in this respect are probably better than ad hoc.
Yes, that I think that what do you mean by systematic predictable behavior? Sorry, I think I lost you at the very end.
Yeah, so there's, it's just, if the market can predict how we're going to take into account financial disruptions, and maybe legislated for, or very clear, I don't want to go so far as to say rules, but you could imagine a rule that said, when interest rate spreads get to this certain amount, then we're going to start, adjusting our interest rate to adapt for that. I don't know. It just seems like the key thing is the predictability, and that's why you get the result that in the cheap talk game you're okay with volatility so long as it's predictable, because you know the policy.
No, any policy that would make it more predictable and also less endogenous, so maybe fixing what the behavior is going to be on the policymaker side, should help in this sense. Any ability to commit to, making the policy predictable.
So I took a longer discussion there because you said you were about to finish. I hope you are, because you have about 2 minutes left.
I am.
I've stolen lots of your time.
No, I am. This is the final slide. I somehow thought the presentation would be 15 minutes, so ended up well. So so what are the main takeaways? First, that the central bank that cares about financial stability might induce investment in policy biases. And this is especially true if the central bank cares only about a few players, potentially the ones that are too big to fail. A central bank that puts low weight on markets is a partial fix. The problem there is that it will surprise too often relative to optimal. And then if there's a further inefficiency if the Fed has a communicable private information about future policy. And in that case, even markets might prefer a kitish central banker. So I think, this is all I wanted to present today. In the paper, we also deal with repeated interactions. But I think the most interesting takeaways are actually what is in the slides.
Okay, good. Well, that was good on time. Maybe privately, I'll ask you why you chose kites rather than some other bird of prey or some other intermediate bird case, the robin or something. But anyway, I'll ask you that separately.
Happy to answer it separately.
Okay. Good. Okay. Well, then, without further ado, Gianpaolo, thank you very much.
Yes,
and I'm going to hand over straight away to Peter, so he gets going. And unmute yourself.
Oops. Okay, can you hear me and see the slides?
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah, good.
Okay, fantastic. So hi everyone, thanks for joining, and thanks Michael for inviting me to talk. So as the slide suggests, I'm going to be talking about how the intermediation of central bank messages influences household beliefs. So I've used an experimental design, like Elena as well, to answer this question, which I'll sort of detail in the talk, as well as discuss some of the key results. There we go. So not that this audience needs much of an introduction or motivation for this topic, but broadly, we know that there's been an increased focus on communication by central banks, although up until recently, much of this has sort of been focused on so-called experts. And because of this increased desire to communicate with the public, there's also been increased academic research seeking to understand the effects of this. And there's been a lot of work in this area, both experimental and quasi-experimental, including obviously by a lot of people probably tuning in today. And a lot of this work has assumed that experiment participants or the general public in general receive their information directly from the central bank. However, the public, if they receive any information at all about the macroeconomy, typically get this from the newsmedia. And I mean, there's a lot of surveys around the world from central banks sort of showing these kind of results. And so what I'm interested in is the way in which the transformation that occurs between the central bank and the information the public actually receives begins to influence the way that participants either form or update their beliefs. So just to be very concrete about about what I'm doing, the specific question I'm trying to actually answer here is whether a consumer source of economic information affects their beliefs. And to my mind, there's sort of two reasons to think that it might. The first is that the information is coming from a particular source, and consumers will associate these sources with certain levels of credibility. Secondly, the information that's contained, for example, in an FOMC statement, is considerably different to what actually gets sent out in news summaries that the public are more likely to pick up on. And what I would like to do is be able to distinguish between these two effects. So of course, these two effects would also have very different policy recommendations. So the first perhaps is a little bit out of the control of a central bank and might require, as has been suggested by some literature, a direct communication line between the central bank and the public, although that's something that's thus far been quite elusive for most central banks around the world. And the second would perhaps call for a little bit more direct communication between central banks and the media themselves, particularly working with journalists to ensure that the key messages that they actually want to get to the public are actually sent out properly. So just as a bit of a spoiler, I suppose, to whet the appetite, I find that holding the information that consumers receive constant, and therefore all the detail is the same, we don't have to worry about the difference between what gets sent in a USA Today article versus an FOMC statement, holding all of that constant, the source that people actually believe the information is coming from affects how much they update their beliefs. And this isn't simply just a media bad, official source good, which I'll sort of go through when I go through the results in more detail. Secondly, I find that the additional detail that's often missing from news summaries or truncated to make them a little bit more perhaps appealing to the public considerably assists people in their updating of beliefs. And this is actually in contrast to some of the literature findings at present, although most of that was done in periods of low inflation. And finally, I find that these effects are particularly strong for groups that are less engaged and typically less informed about economics, suggesting pretty strong information frictions. So I thought an information provision experiment was the best way to tease out these effects. And I find that participants, I provide participants with either central bank statements or news summaries. And just to be clear here, these aren't opinion pieces critiquing the nuances of forward guidance policies or just how many billions of dollars need to be purchased in an asset program. These are short summaries that are typically published, within 3 or 4 minutes of a central bank statement being released. They're largely copy-pasted swathes of text from an original statement that's sent out, of course, truncating a lot of that detail. So in this experiment, 3,000 participants undertook it across 6 treatment groups. And they were between groups, so participants only saw one of the 6 treatments. All of this was done in January 2023, although it does help to think of it as 3 distinct experiments, which I'll run through now. So on the screen here, we have 6 treatments that I mentioned. For now, I'll just focus on the top row, surrounded by that red box there. And the first treatment on our left-hand side is the central bank statement. Here we're using the Reserve Bank of Australia, given the setting in Australia. The second and third treatments there are news summaries. I've used these 2 media brands here, so ABC News and news.com.au, to get an additional read on the role of credibility and trustworthiness. So these 2 media brands, ABC News and news.com.au, are the 2 largest media brands in the country. So they're the first and second most visited news websites, but they're also the 10th and 11th most visited websites in the country. So they're sort of the main 2 sources of news in the country. And what's nice is that these 2 media brands actually differ in their perceived public credibility and trustworthiness. So I elicit participant beliefs in my survey about whether or not these sources of information are trustworthy, particularly when it comes to receiving economic information. And I find very similar patterns to when there are sort of public surveys done of trustworthy media in the entire country. And this perceived difference allows me to sort of tease out whether it's just a media difference or if it's actually lining up with the credibility and trustworthiness that people, the beliefs that people have of these sources of information. So if I compare consumer outcomes across these 3 treatments, which I'll talk about which outcomes I'm including in a second, I'll call that sort of the total effect. So I mentioned that I was interested in purging out the differences in information and actually measuring the source, the effect of actually where did this piece of information come from. So of course, a very simple way to do this would be just to have one statement and tell participants it came from 3 different places. Given, of course, that we can't lie in these experiments, what I do is I construct textually similar documents by exploiting the fact that these news summaries are typically just large copy-pasted swathes of text from the original statement. So here I'm just showing a Venn diagram just to illustrate what I've done. But what I'm interested in is sort of that overlap point between the news summaries and the central bank statement. So this crossover you can think of as like a new statement, basically, or a new document. So just to give you a bit of a sense of what's going on here, there's a central bank statement was around 700 words, and the condensed statement, that sort of bit that overlaps across all 3 components, was about 150 words. So there's a lot of condensing going on here. And as we sort of might have suspected before we even went into this, there's a lot of sort of truncating of a central bank information before it gets to the public. So just to give you a sense of actually what's missing here, when we're talking about the difference between this condensed statement and the central bank, we've got a lot of missing information on where inflation's going, what channels are particularly at play at the moment. Maybe it's the exchange rate channel they're expecting shocks through. Maybe it's talking about terms of trade. All that extra detail is basically missing. What we're left with, though, is the current inflation rate, the decision on actually what happened to interest rates in this particular month, forecasts for inflation over the next sort of year and 3 years, as well as some direct quotes in this particular example about how the central bank is committed to ensuring inflation gets back to target. Now, relative to the news summaries, which typically start out at around 300 or 400 words, what we're actually missing is things like mortgage cost calculators and things that make it a little bit more personal for individuals. So we're not really getting much of the fact stripped out. We're just getting sort of the thing that might actually make consumers actually click on this. So with this new condensed statement, which is similar across all 3 brands, I can truthfully tell participants that the text that they're actually reading comes from 3 different places. And that is, to be very clear about this, I can control for the detail and the information provided and vary the source. And therefore, comparing across these 3 treatments enables me to identify and estimate the source effect. Now, finally, you might have sort of worked this out already, but by comparing the original central bank statement and then that condensed statement that's stated to come from the central bank, I can identify the effect of removing all that additional contextual information that typically occurs in the media transformation process anyway. So before I get to the results, I'll just sort of briefly explain
Peter,
that.
just very quickly. I mean, one I guess issue be nice to know the answer to is when you were condensing, you're kind of constraining yourself a lot by having to condense for an overlap between ABC, News.com, and the RBA. In theory, you could have just done it with one of them. I don't know, but maybe you'll tell me that ABC and News.com have essentially the same content, so they condense in the same way, and then it doesn't matter. But it might be that you're getting too condensed. There might be a sort of Goldilocks effect of condensing.
Yeah, I guess I think it's closer towards the former, where they're basically picking up the same story. They're picking up the same messages. Okay. They're picking up the forecast. They're picking up the current inflation rate as stated by sort of the National Statistics Agency. One thing you might miss is like a particular quote is not going to be the exact same across the 2 media brands. So I've had to take that out. So perhaps that was the Goldilocks where I wouldn't have had to do that. But I'm not sort of losing the factual elements that I think is sort of the key part of what's being stripped out here.
Okay.
The other thing was I wanted to be careful that it wasn't just a sort of media versus official source of information. I wanted to be able to sort of distinguish between a highly trustworthy and a less highly trustworthy institution, although I didn't actually know how people trusted the central bank at the time. Of course, I worked that out afterwards. So I conduct attention checks, as you might expect. I survey participants prior to the treatments. They read the treatment text, and then they ask them a bunch of questions afterwards. Because this was run online, and I wanted to sort of avoid keeping people. So I basically wanted to keep this as brief as possible, obviously, so that people weren't getting bored and swiveling around on their chairs. And sort of, it was a very short experiment with the median completion time, about 8 minutes. In terms of the questions and the outcomes that I'm actually going to sort of measure, I ask about inflation expectations, interest rate expectations, the trust they have in the source, so that I can map that to whether or not, for a start, whether or not that looks like the general surveys that have been done in the country, and then also specifically to which sources they trust. I then also ask them after the treatments they receive, their understanding of the message, whether or not they agree with the actual decision that was taken by the central bank, the perception of it. I then elicit the inflation expectations again and interest rate expectations before finally eliciting some financial literacy measures. So for today, I'll just focus on the differential effects of treatments on inflation belief revisions. And if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about the effect on perceptions, but we'll stick with the inflation beliefs for now. So just to inform the likely direction that we might expect from this source effect, this chart shows the perceived trustworthiness of the information sources as a place to get economic information. So as you can see, the directionality lines up with sort of those previous surveys that I might have suggested. The ABC is sort of the BBC equivalent in Australia. It's not a super original naming convention. And it's more trusted than news.com.au by quite a fair margin. Here, just to be clear, 3 represents neutrality. So it's a 1 to 5 Likert scale, basically. And so what we do have is that all these sources of information are in some sense absolutely trusted. It's just there's a differential amongst how much credibility there is. And obviously you can see that the central bank sits in between the two brands here. So the timing of the survey in early 2023 likely affected this trustworthiness rating of the central bank. But the overall sort of absolute level doesn't really affect my results. What I'm interested in is the differences, sort of the variability across, and can that explain differences in updating? So what I'll show in my results is the output from 2 key specifications. The first looks at the way in which participants update their beliefs on average. So that's the robust OLS estimate. On the left-hand side, we have the change in the inflation expectations from the prior to the posterior. So that's the delta pi E. And on the right-hand side, we just have the standard treatment they received, as well as a whole host of demographic factors. You might have noticed in the sort of 2 by 6 that I didn't have a passive control group. So in fact, what I'm relying on here is an active control group. So when I make the comparisons, I'll be very clear about what I'm comparing to. But typically it's going to be the RBA statement is sort of that baseline. But what I'm really actually finding is the differences of one treatment versus the differences that occurred when they received the central bank statement. Of course, it might be that average revisions don't actually change much, but participants still do move closer to a signal that they've been provided. So just to investigate this, I also consider the likelihood that the participants are moving closer to the forecast that they've actually been provided in the text, and that's what this probit estimation is doing. So just turning to the results now, obviously there's a big table I'll sort of walk us through, but realistically for now, I'm just focusing on that red rectangle. And what I'm showing here is the total effect, that first horizontal red box that I showed in the design. And we won't read too much into this because obviously there's a whole lot of effects going on underneath, but just to outline how this table works. So for the first 2 columns, I'm showing the results for the robust OLS. The negative coefficient tells us that relative to the RBA, people are updating more. And that is basically because typically participants have much higher inflation expectations than the targets there, than the central bank targets, and then also by the forecast. So what we're seeing is a larger revision downwards when people receive the ABC statement versus when they receive the central bank statement. And the opposite is true in this case for the news.com.au summary. And just to be clear here, 0.4 represents 40 basis points. So we're talking in the realm of inflation expectations. But to decompose this effect, we can turn to comparing the beliefs of those who receive the condensed central bank statement. So that's the sort of shortened, reconstructed statement that mirror the detail that gets transmitted by the media, and the standard central bank statement. So now we're looking at this green row. The coefficient of around 0.4 on the OLS results suggests that participants on average revise their beliefs by up to 40 basis points less when they don't have the extra detail provided by the long central bank statement. So basically they seem to be either unwilling to, most likely unable to provide more, larger revisions in their beliefs. Perhaps it's because they don't view this source as credible or as accurate. And to put this in context, the participants who received the full statement, of course, it's not against a true control, so there's a little bit of an asterisk against this, but they revised their beliefs by about 150 basis points relative to 0. So the 40 basis points is around a third less than what you would expect from a full sort of central bank statement. And that kind of lines up with what's been found in other areas. Furthermore, the probit results, so what I was just talking about was on average. The probit results in the second, the third and the fourth column, tell us that not only do the participants revise by less on average, they're also less likely to even change their beliefs in the correct direction. So we've kind of got the 2 margins captured here. So this might come as a little bit of a surprise, as some previous literature, for example, a paper by Kobion, Weber, and Gronichenko in 2022, found that if you provided participants with a full FOMC statement, that didn't do anything more to beliefs than simply just giving them either an inflation target or the inflation forecast. However, a key difference between my study and theirs is that this one was conducted in 2023. As you can see on the graph, I think we all know where inflation was around that time, but we had a highly uncertain and volatile environment. In contrast, much of the previous literature showing that additional detail in these statements doesn't help people was done in periods of relative economic calm. So as such, one explanation, I think, for the differences between my finding and the existing sort of literature or the existing view is that there's a bit of a state dependence in what information and level of detail helps people form their beliefs, but also update their beliefs. Turning now to that source effect, this is the effect I can identify by purging all the differences in the detail and the content, maybe not to the Goldilocks level, but to some extent between the news summaries and the central bank statement. And instead, I'm just varying the source. The OLS coefficient here on the ABC statement shows that participants revised their belief by around 50 basis points more when they received the information that came from the more trustworthy ABC brand rather than the RBA. And in contrast, participants that received the information from news.com.au revised their beliefs by 20 basis points less. And this is the exact directionality that we would have expected given the perceived trustworthiness that was told to us by the participants. So overall, these results show that consumers are considerably influenced in their formation of beliefs by the perceived credibility of the source that provides them sort of the economic information, but on top of that, the detail and the context that actually provided in this information. And just before I finish, I thought that digging into the heterogeneity often provides a bit more flavor around some of these results and maybe helps illuminate some of the paths forward for policymakers, or to start thinking about some paths forward for these things. The first one I'm showing here is the detail effect. And reminder that this is comparing the shortened central bank statement to the full central bank statement. The positive coefficient shows that participants updated by less. So we already know that on average. What I'm doing here is splitting up the sample by different participant characteristics, showing high and low characteristics. So the broad stroke story here is that the additional detail and context appears to be useful irrespective of who receives the information. One way of thinking about this is that there's contextual information is not really getting through to any participants currently, even though they're highly engaged. Otherwise, they wouldn't really be updating so much in response to this publicly available information. It might be sitting on the central bank website, but it's not really making it much past that. The source effect, on the other hand, particularly influences participants who've not studied economics before, less engaged with economics and low economic literacy. So high engagement and highly educated in terms of economics individuals are much less influenced by the source of the information and much more by the content. And this suggests that the less understanding an individual has, the more they're actually relying on the branding of the information they're actually receiving. And this provides an extra caution to sort of the effect that originally, I guess, was talked about by Grodnichenko, Kobian and Weber, that not only are we sort of having this source effect, it's particularly influencing the people that are most susceptible to receiving information in this way. So overall, just to summarize, I find that when I can purge any differences in detail or information, I find that the source of information considerably influences the way that households update and form their beliefs. And it's not just simply a media bad, official source good story. The directionality seems to line up with the source trust elicited by participants. The explanatory detail that's typically missing from news websites or summaries is found to particularly assist updating. And I note that this is in contrast to the existing literature, that which has sort of mostly been found in low inflation environments. I find that this detail effect is strong for both a sort of high and low literacy and engaged participants, but in particular, the source effect really originates from the less informed and less engaged individuals. And again, this sort of suggests a bit of a caution to central banks relying on the media to transmit their messages to those particular groups of the population. And finally, I just thought that this work suggests, just to add to the pile, yet another explanation for the considerable belief dispersion among households. And that's that they receive their information from different sources, even if the information itself is the same, which of course it's also not. So I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions.
Perfect. I realized there was a flaw in my plan, which is if we stop now, then people are going to have to email Peter to ask him questions, because all of the Q&A will get shut down. But anyway, and I'm going to have to end it there. So Peter, if I get any separately, I will pass them on. But I would like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank our 3 presenters, as you can see, either on a sort of topical or a methodological approach. I think our future is safe. That researchers will be looking at, central bank communication and all the big issues. And so, yeah, wonderful to have you all today. Wonderful that we had, at one point, I know people drifted it out, but at one point we had around 65 people, which is more than I promised you. And I don't know if you guys could see it, but I hope none of you were looking and getting nervous. But yeah, it's great to see people are still engaged. Yeah, and apart from that, we'll have another one of these in a month. And yeah, keep watching your email for the updates. And thanks on behalf of everyone. I'm going to do the official clap, and then yeah, I hope everyone has a good rest of day, evening, or goes to bed nice and happy now that they've seen this. Or Gianpaolo, you're the one who I know is earliest. You have a whole day to get on with, so enjoy it. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.